down from the smallest process up to the largest systems. Everything we do, everything we think of should be with AI in mind. What generative AI is doing is it's really unlocking creativity, right? And it is removing all of the barriers of technical knowledge that you have to have, right? You can take somebody who has never written a line of code and they can develop an entire application. We kept focusing in on the risks rather than just addressing them. For each one of the risks, what are ways that we can, mitigate that? And then understanding then the benefits, obviously, and as long as those benefits outweigh the risks, you typically will win most over. Education and awareness are unbelievably critical, and you do find with those organizations who are not adopting it as quickly, it's really just boiling down to is that they're not investing enough time in raising that awareness around, obviously, the good and the bad.
Welcome to the new automation mindset, where AI, automation, and integration come together. I'm your host, Markus, and as Chief Strategy Officer and part of the founding executive team at Workato, it is my mission to find these top innovators in AI, automation, and integration and share their journeys with all of you. Today, I have with me Mike Lebron. Mike is Canon's head of digital applications and shared services and has a 20-year history building Canon's technology capabilities, including enterprise architecture, solution architecture, IT innovation, and then overseeing the front office system. So important for today, Mike is actually also chairing Canon's committee for generative AI. And that's what I'm really excited about, to have him share with all of us kind of insights about this committee. And I think there'll be some really, really interesting learnings for all of us. And maybe some of us want to start a committee just like Mike did. So Mike, first of all, welcome. Tell us about this committee for generative AI at Canon. And I'm really curious to hear a little, how it started, maybe what was the impetus to get this going? How did that journey evolve, maybe change over time a little bit? Tell us the history of the Gen AI committee at Canon, please.
Sure. Hi, Markus. Thank you for the opportunity. In 2023, obviously generative AI has been around for many years, but in 2023, we started to see shifts in the way our employees were starting to conduct business. And we did that through measuring, understanding of, the websites that they're going in. We started to see more and more usage of ChatGPT and other generative AI solutions. Obviously, that raised a pretty stark concern, with our leadership. At that time, we didn't know much about it. We knew a lot about the technology itself, but not much about, the dangers. And it really did start with a focus of the dangers, in fact. We started to talk about, with our leadership, the democratization within the organization, but we also realized that the democratization was occurring within other companies, right? So meaning that if we hadn't jumped on this bandwagon, we were going to be left behind. So when we formed the committee, it wasn't just about dealing with the dangers, but it was really about unlocking productivity and creativity while protecting our company, right? So in the end. So when we kicked off this committee, we did start with policy, and the policy wasn't meant to suppress. In fact, when we started to really think about, what we could do to protect the company, it was about protecting, but also encouraging and exploring. And so we developed a policy that provides the guardrails while also highlighting some of the dangers that could be out there. Dangers, such as intellectual property, right? The dangers around adoption in areas where could be high risk, for us. in addition to evaluating executive awareness, right? Evaluating and raising executive awareness. And so for us, it was all about trying to move the needle while, again, reducing, the risks to our company.
It's really interesting. I was at a conference last week, and there, the keynote was done by a person. Zach Cass is his name. He was actually at OpenAI for a little while in go-to-market, and then he decided to, do keynotes and focus on, basically giving a perspective of generative AI. And what's interesting is like he gave a keynote all about, how you said about the dangers. Like, one of his analogies that he brought was how people adopted the elevator back then. Apparently, it was all about fear and about dangers. And it took quite a while for people actually are willing to kind of face that fear. There were little things like, for example, like placing an operator into an elevator, that really helped with the adoption. They want something human. They kind of, I think, fundamentally mistrust machines, I guess, is one of his points that he had. So it started with fear. I think, from what you told me last time, it is evolving into opportunity also. Like, the one thing I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that one of the key initiatives that the committee has was upskilling your employees also, right? About AI. What did you roll out there? Tell me about it, because it seems like, okay, well, there's a fear of that generative AI and you set guardrails and policies, but then I think there's probably also enough fear to say like, look, if we don't adopt that, maybe that's actually even worse, right?
Yeah.
So what was that drive around upskilling and so on? What exactly did you do, and maybe what advice would you give other people?
Yeah, it started with fear, but that actually is probably one of the smallest aspects, of the committee. Fear, in other words, fear of usage. But as we started to expand, obviously, the scope of the committee's reach, we started to bring on human resources. In fact, our talent management, talent and learning and development, as part of the committee, we brought on our marketing group, our sales organization. So slowly but surely we started to include the various groups to where almost every organization is represented, within the committee. So as part of that, we focused very heavily on awareness and education. So as part of the committee, we're always looking for opportunities to educate our employee base. Obviously it starts within the community. It's the committee with it in itself. Educating those members, being able to take that message back to their organization, and then find opportunities, where generative AI can be further promoted. So, we focus on not only, kind of these horizontal solutions, right? Solutions such as Microsoft Copilot or Gemini, right, that are released, as part of your desktop platform. But more importantly, some of those vertical solutions, that are very specific to those organizations. But we're also assessing the risks, right? We're continually assessing the risks. As this committee is evolving, so is the maturity in our understanding of what those risks are. In addition, we do find with many of the committee members and many of the employees that I've spoken with, that there's a fear of that, hey, my job is going to be replaced. So it's not just about the technical risks or the potential, liabilities, but also to try to encourage, our workforce, to leverage these kind of tool sets so that, as an individual, they are creating a competitive advantage, and we continually stress that not just as an organization, but even as an individual, that if you don't gain that skill set, you could be left behind, right? And you can kind of compare it to those who have access, to calculators or computers, right? For example, today, could you imagine operating a business without a computer? No. Individuals couldn't be successful within business without a computer, let alone an organization. So we try to address that. So it's very broad, the committee. We're tackling all aspects, just gaining awareness at the executive level, and trying to support funding. So again, as we think about those verticals, each of those organizations are experimenting with different solutions, and sometimes they need support, and that's why the committee is there. Raise awareness up to the executive leadership, get the funding, and making sure that when this is being implemented, whether it be at the departmental or divisional, that it's being done in a safe way. And then lastly, try to scale it. When we see a success, let's try to scale it, and let's try to get it out into the enterprise.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned executives multiple times. Now, we're both technologists in a way, right? My sense is, this is my personal opinion, is like I haven't seen really in multiple decades any new technology that has gotten as much interest and as much attention in the non-IT leadership, if that makes sense, right? It seems like Gen AI really is in a different league. I wonder how you think about this. I mean, it seems like there's, it's a bright light shining on us technologists. I guess can be good or bad, right? I mean, it puts a lot of pressure on it, but then at the other side, it's also an opportunity to shine. I'm curious how you think about this. If you also contrast it with other things like I don't know, e-commerce or mobile or something, it seems like this is a different league.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting observation. I've made the same. I've been fortunate to be in technology long enough. Where we've seen everything from service-oriented architecture, cloud, and but this is probably the first technology that I would say, or capability that has really raised awareness up to our CEO. In fact, I would call it a mandate, to be very honest. That we adopt AI and more specifically generative AI, within our organization. And, I think what it boils down to is even those other capabilities, technologies, that we've been implementing, I don't think that they had the opportunity to necessarily impact at the individual, right? I see much of that, the benefits that we seek were kind of very isolated, non-human, right? But with generative AI, it has the ability to influence that individual's day-to-day tasks, and when we look at that, that becomes a force multiplier, right? And our past CEO, who was our first sponsor, our current CEO, who's even, I would say, more doubling down on this, they recognize this as a force multiplier. They obviously recognize also the dangers, but what was really interesting is whether it was our past and our current, it's one of those, like, we have to take risks, right? And that's why he's given us the latitude, to take those risks, to make those investments, and really to evangelize, within the organization and push it and promote it. So yeah, it's really different. Something that I haven't experienced. I think maybe e-commerce was one of those where, when we were, rolling out e-commerce and, content platforms and so on and so forth, but very, very different, because this is much more personal. This is something where down from the smallest process up to the largest systems, everything we do, everything we think of should be, with AI in mind.
So tell me about this. I mean, I'd be curious about your personal opinion also, because, you've said, like, you're technologist. You mentioned service-oriented architecture. I lived that phase very vividly, remember that. Now, you used a term last time we spoke. You said AI integrated, and that resonated with me. Maybe you want to explain to the audience what do you exactly mean and what that means for Canon also?
Yeah, when we think about, we've been down the AI journey for more than a decade. It's integrated into our products. It's integrated into many of our systems. And, as I mentioned, it was implemented, in these silos, non-human, functions or tasks. And, with AI integrated, it's really integrating, AI into every facet, and again, at the individual level. So whether it's our business operations, in the systems or solutions that we're selecting, driving it into our customer experience, right? Where can we start to leverage AI, that's gonna make a difference, that's going to be the force multiplier. So as a leader within the organization, especially the front office, you can think about the opportunities that we have, to influence our customers, on our brand and our products, all the way through to our call centers, where a call center agent may have these daily mundane tasks that are very manual, but maybe we can use AI to start to automate, some of that in an intelligent way. So, AI integrated, really just boils down to that, when you're thinking about digitizing a process, think about catching up on emails, think about those solutions or capabilities that are at your fingertips. So, the last 2 years we've spent, really, I would say we were in this crawl phase, and we started to get into this walk. I mean, we may sound like we're very advanced, and and we've done a multitude of proof of concepts, but I still say that we're in that walk crawl phase, at this point. But where I see us over the next year and after, it's where every single employee, has access to some generative AI capability, that's helping them do their job in a more, effective way.
Mm-hmm. But it seems to me also like, the service-oriented architecture thing might come alive again, just this time with the brains, right? With the LLMs. It's almost like it feels to me what you're saying is also, hey, don't look at this as just ChatGPT that you manually talk to on a one-by-one basis, like a human to ChatGPT, but there is a potential to kind of drive this smartness into the business processes, right? And almost think about it as like, what kind of advanced automations in a business process can I do if I insert these capabilities? Is that a fair way to think about it?
Yeah. As part of our journey, and within the committee, we've done maybe 10 or more proof of concepts, and it's touched a multitude of our, business units. And the more and more, we started to dig in, we started to identify processes that, were very manual today. And, it's, and automation has been around a while. We talked about, in our past discussion, BPR and digitizing of processes. But the challenge that you have faced with in the past, not only were the tool sets, very cumbersome and complex, but for the most part, you had a lot of edge cases. And quite often the IT organizations, they didn't want to make those investments because they were having to manage these workflows, and constantly programming in, these edge cases. So, within the committee, we're still finding those opportunities, but, the light bulb went off and we started to say, wow, there's this whole capability out there where that we don't necessarily have to manage those edge cases, as long as you're starting to use some of these AI capabilities. And that's kind of how we started to stumble upon, the agentic AI, capability. So digitizing, of these processes and automating of these processes. In fact, the committee's taken on a whole new light. A few weeks ago, I'm talking to the committee, and I'm saying, I don't think we're just the generative AI committee anymore. I think, we're a committee of automation, in fact, intelligent automation, because AI is just one means of automating. It's a way of automation that, in the past, the human, would do, but it's going to do it in a different way. So we've started to think about, how we can now start to string together some of our experiences around generative AI, and really address the concerns of IT, in the past of those edge cases and ways that, we can extend these capabilities out to the business units and start digitizing these processes. And I'll give you one example. Within our call center, we get feeds from our surveys. And I was just speaking this morning with our, head of service. And, it's a challenge. You can imagine that you have all these surveys, these come in, or responses, to surveys that are coming in. And, they need to be funneled to all different types of service agents. And it's a very manual process today. So is it automated? Sure. The data comes in, there's a workflow, but somebody has to evaluate, these survey responses and then route them to the proper resource. Guess what? An AI agent can do that. It can analyze, that survey response, and based on the training that we've done, route it to the appropriate agent, and maybe even address that, disposition it to an email or disposition it to one of our other channels, to close and hopefully, retain and have a happy customer, at the end. So, that's just one example. Another example, we all of us in IT, we manage contracts, with our various vendors. And one of the big challenges is when we have a contract, we have to review it, work with legal. And, obviously there are business terms that are in there that, that we have to review. But, being able to automate that, and provide us a risk assessment, obviously, look, we do rely on legal, but it's a very laborious task. And, hundreds of contracts a year are being analyzed. So, these are just examples where those are force multipliers, because you're shaving hours and hours a week, off somebody's, off their time where they can be, reappropriated to doing something much more meaningful than, not that reading through surveys are meaningful, but, to be honest, that is labor intensive, or not that reviewing contracts isn't meaningful. But we can shift those, that time to more meaningful tasks.
It's actually really, really interesting. Both examples that you mentioned, like the surveys and then the legal kind of documents, I guess they all fall under, what we used to call unstructured data, right? It was basically text. I mean, you have text examples. I mean, there could be other unstructured data, also maybe video or something like that. But in this case, it's text. I think in the old world, it was really hard to understand this stuff with before Gen AI, like the good old machine learning and so on. I remember, understanding an email and classifying an email and so on. It was a Herculean task. And frankly, maybe it would work in English, but then it wouldn't work in another language, right? And now with these large language models, I mean, we have examples where contracts, like legal contract constructs, which in the old days for intelligent document processing, that was unheard of. Like, okay, you could understand invoices, but contracts, no way. That was too hard. Well, now you can. And then, if the next one comes in Korean, it'll still understand it, which is almost like mind-boggling, but it's true. And so I think it opens up that opportunity to look at a whole new set of processes that before were almost impossible to automate. There was whenever unstructured data came in, it was really hard to do something with it, but now you can. And maybe, I guess what you're telling us is Gen AI is almost like a back door that lets you think about all the automations that are still possible in your company, right? And maybe to think about it, don't think about it just as, hey, it has to be like ChatGPT, but no, there's other things that can be applied to. This is, you can that process of distributing survey results based on qualitative language statements, you now can actually distribute it to the right person, to maybe the engineers that need to improve the product, or marketing that needs to understand that someone really likes certain things, or support if they need to improve something. It is now possible, actually. I think it opens a whole new world, huh?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's not just about the keywords anymore, but even tone, of the email, something that, so context now is so much more critical in that next decision step. I think in the past, when we were digitizing, business processes, into these workflows, you didn't have that kind of capability, that you have today. Maybe you need to escalate. And again, all of this, I mean, it sounds almost like black magic, when you think about it, because, in the past, when we were defining these workflows, every step had to be predefined, right, in automation. And that was automation. And to the end user, they didn't know that, some developers spent, thousands of hours, orchestrating, all of these, different execution steps and developing, all of these exceptions and so on and so forth. And today, in fact, we've seen some of the solutions out there where they're dynamically generating the various workflow sets. So not even, sending an email, but maybe escalating up for an approval, or even sending out a push message, something that we didn't develop, but, the agent was understood, the context of that step that it was in, and it decided to, push it to an alternate path that would have had to been programmed in. So, and again, and then the plug and play nature, I think, is also, is really also a game changer, so that you can start to reuse, much of what you've pre-developed. And if you want to adapt that workflow, maybe something that was developed for our service center and adapt it maybe to our legal group, so, you can imagine now the amount of time savings from the IT perspective, just for maintaining some of these flows. So I think we're in an amazing time, and we're still at the beginning. I still say we're still in this crawl walk stage. It's moving so fast, that you feel like you're running at this point, but in reality, I think we're still crawling.
So I guess what you're saying is really, when you think about Gen AI, think about business processes, think about automations, and then I guess there's two areas of potential. Number one is that there's certain business processes that before were just unautomatable in a way, right? Because of there was unstructured data, or for whatever reason, that you just in that if this then that kind of approach of all the like specifying all the exceptions, you just couldn't deal with it because you couldn't understand the data. Now you can. So there's a whole new universe of stuff you can address. And then I guess the other thing you said was, hey, even for the regular automations, the benefit now with Gen AI is that it gets easier. It's like you don't have to deal with every single minute exception, and you don't have to specify the whole thing. It's like you can actually start much more easily. And that BPR, that business process reengineering, that before there was a lot of hurdles to get it right. I mean, I've seen it myself. I mean, very few of these projects really worked out as a huge success because it was so hard, because you had to think through all the edge cases. Now, I think you get a head start almost, like the technology is helping you. It almost like lowers the barrier to entry for doing good business processes in a way. Is that?
Yeah, it's not just even the barrier of entry. Obviously, that's huge. But I think the cost of ownership, quite often, we would calculate the cost of ownership of digitizing a process, and we'd say, doesn't make sense, because it's yes, the business obviously is going to gain that benefit, but the cost of us maintaining it, just didn't make a lot of sense. But, I think it's a different world today. For us now, we are thinking very horizontally. And, I mentioned that, we look at vertical and horizontal solutions. Again, a horizontal solution could be like a Microsoft Copilot, for example. However, I also see it as, a horizontal solution is maybe meshing together two processes that are very complementary. So if you think about an e-commerce site, right, there's always a service opportunity. So it's not just about a sale, but it's also about retention, right? So being able to now orchestrate these processes together, or maybe it's part of our supply chain, in the sales organization. So, I think there are so many opportunities, now that you have, this capability of understanding context, right? That's a game changer, right? And, and again, we're at the beginning. Um, I mean, I'm sitting here thinking of ideas, literally, of all the ideas that that we can do, and it's which one though is going to kind of get us the biggest bang for the buck, at this point. Which one is going to get us in market, quickly, which one is going to have the biggest return. We're always looking at that. We always operate on an ROI. We're always looking at that cost of ownership. But nonetheless, I think we're in some exciting times.
So the more and more I think about it, you know how I know it's a big word, but we talk about democratizing technology, right? If you think about like CRM systems, what it used to be like a Siebel system. I don't know if you ever worked with that. And then now you have Salesforce. There is definitely a step of democratization. I mean, back then you needed like super duper experts, and now a whole new class of less technical people can actually deal with the beast if you want, right? It seems to me like the Gen AI is maybe the biggest democratization we've seen ever, if that makes sense, because now, again, you don't need to be so precise with all your exception cases, because you had the context. You have someone almost thinking with you, which is makes it easier. I don't know if you're familiar with this concept of vibe programming, where people, really not programmers, just basically start working with a co-pilot and in an iterative dialogue kind of create applications. And it almost feels like a miracle because they're not trained programmers. They just describe what they want, and the AI helps them realize this. It's very, very powerful as a total democratization. Is that how you think about this? And then I guess what does that mean at the end? I'm specifically, maybe you have some examples, these proof of concepts that you guys built. Because what I'm always thinking through is like, what does that new solutioning, you're a solution architect, right? There's a new type of solutioning with Gen AI that's happening, and it feels like it is different from the old solutioning. It's more iterative. So it's more experimentation. It actually feels less like that programming step, more of a discovery, or maybe what a data scientist used to do. I'm curious how any lessons learned there from your proof of concepts?
Yeah, what generative AI is doing is it's really unlocking creativity, right? And it is removing all of the barriers of necessary the technical knowledge that you have to have, right? It's really interesting, that you can take somebody who has never written a line of code, and they can develop an entire application. And so one of the, an example of this is, we evaluated, and we are using today GitHub Copilot. And it's a multitude of tools, but, I'll use that one as our example. But, being able to measure the productivity, of our developers, and the impact that it could have. And one of our R&D teams, we work with, as part of the committee, did this study, and it is a multiplier of effectiveness that we saw coming out of this study, to a point, where, on average, most developers, let's say the average developer can, let's say, write 100 lines of code a day on average, let's say, for average complexity. And, what we were seeing is in the thousands of lines of code per day, coming out of the generative AI. So, obviously that has a huge impact, on an engineering organization, when it comes to productivity. Another example, we have started to use generative AI on the quality side. So, we have a fair amount of offshore development, and a lot of that code needs to come in, needs to get accepted, for the most part, we had architects reviewing a lot of the code and, providing feedback, whether it's for security or functional or non-functional, reasons. And what we found is that for the most part, we were inspecting roughly 3% of the source code that was coming back at any given point. We had a number of various architects that would work on this weekly. And these are guys who are, I would say that should be focused on solutioning rather than inspecting code. But, and nonetheless, that was part of their responsibility. And when we started to leverage generative AI, it was not only identifying what they were identifying, but where they were inspecting 3% of the code, AI is inspecting now 100% of the code. In addition to, we were able to do classification better. So we were able to identify, what truly was a security concern and then prioritize those. In fact, the AI was prioritizing it for us. But even technical debt, understanding how much technical debt. So in other words, functionally it was fine, security was fine, but it was overly complex. And really what was interesting is we started to identify, how much technical debt we had. In other words, being able to predict when a defect potentially could occur when another developer came in and started to change that code, right? Because higher complexity code that has technical debt, built into it is going to, has a higher propensity of having a defect. So, these are just examples where, generative AI is reshaping not only our organization, but I think it's reshaping an industry. We've thought about, even leveraging more of the generative AI in code development and augmenting, some of our processes. And it's not to say that we're replacing, but it's being able to do more, right? And that's the key, right? Being able to deliver more experiences to our customers or more capabilities, to our business. So the generative AI has been, it's democratizing capabilities that often you have, but that are very specialized. And you're able to take an individual, that may not be the expert. And in the end, as they leverage generative AI, they're able to just do more. And the do more could be a lot of different reasons, whether it's capacity or knowledge or, generative AI can close those gaps. So, for us, it's one of the main reasons why we need to get it in our hands of, of all our employees. Because it takes even kind of that individuals coming right out of school may not have the experience, or the knowledge, within the area or the discipline, that they're working in today. And it turns them into somebody who's 5 or 10 years, their elder or, experience wise. And, so it really is a game changer, so democratizing, I think it's a great term to use. We think about democratization of just the usage of it, but in reality, it's democratizing knowledge, right? That you normally just would not have. That's how I see it as.
Now, listen, Mike, we went from like fear in the early days to, I think all the examples you walked us through, and thank you for that. And, this vision of democratizing business processes and automations and so on, and kind of tackling new automations that weren't even possible before. All of that's very positive, right? It feels like there's humongous potential and success right ahead of us. So fear to success. What do you think is like holding us back, like the challenges right now to really grab that opportunity? Or like, I'm just curious I don't know if you have these discussions on the committee. Like what are the key challenges that really, maybe don't hold us back from getting there even faster? I'm curious.
I still think that there's a significant amount of fear, that's holding most back. I think, unplaced fear or a lack of understanding. I think that lack of understanding is what's driving the fear, and that's why we formed this committee, right? Because we recognized, early on, and I could see it within our executive leadership, and certain individuals were, well, there's a risk of data leakage, and there's this risk of intellectual property, and so we kept focusing in on the risks rather than just addressing them, right? And being able to get your arms around, okay, for each one of the risks, what are ways that we can mitigate that, and then understanding then the benefits, obviously, and as long as those benefits outweigh the risks, you typically will win most over. I've even spoken to some individuals who say, I will never use generative AI because it's going to take my job away, right? Or I'm going to lose that creative aspect of my job. And, and in reality, I find, that it enhances, or it could enhance creativity. Again, no different than what a calculator did for a scientist. We look at the content, content on our corporate website, for example. Quite often, we have the creative folks who are focusing, who are working on this content, and and quite often they want to be able to put their own spin or their own message into it. But in reality, if you think about the scalability of that, it's not going to even come close to what a generative AI can do. So, from my perspective, I think that they can deliver a multitude of messages, and still achieve, what they sought after, and still, I think, still enjoy, what they do in the day to day. So I think as long as we don't take that away, that enjoyment, or the creativity of the day to day, I think that you can get past it. So again, education and awareness are unbelievably critical, and you do find with those organizations who are not adopting it as quickly, it's really just boiling down to is that they're not investing enough time, in raising that awareness, around obviously the good and the bad.
Mm. All right. No, this is good. This is super helpful. So look, goal of the podcast, really, this conversation here was kind of my goal to motivate people to also have their own committees for generative AI, right? So I hope we did that. I hope people saw that this is meaningful, that this will actually guide you forward. Other than taking the step of forming the committee, I'm just curious, last questions, like what advice would you give people? Like, how would you organize that, set that up? Maybe also what should they not do? Maybe there's some learnings about what to avoid, or maybe also then what really got you forward with that committee. If you gave some advice to the audience here,
you have to start at the top, to be very honest, and you shouldn't be afraid, to raise awareness, at the top. You really need to get the buy-in, of your leadership. It is very, very difficult to transform if you're transforming from the bottom. And it is a transformation, and it should be seen as that. It should be seen as a cultural shift, a shift in your DNA, in the way you do business, and you have to be open-minded. And if you don't have, buy-in from the top at the executive leadership, I think that journey is going to be that much more difficult, and it just frankly just won't be successful. Now as an individual, I would say, don't be afraid to experiment in your own personal life. We encourage our employees to not just experiment here, but experiment in your own personal life. I think you can gain the knowledge of the various platforms, gain the knowledge around prompt engineering, but also gain even the knowledge around some of the dangers, right? So it shouldn't just be within the confounds of our company, but also in the personal life. So I think if I had to really focus in on the two within your organization. Start at the top. Don't be afraid, to experiment also within your personal life, around automation and generative AI, even automation, to be very honest. I don't think you should be afraid to automate it. Play with the different platforms out there, and you'd be surprised on how much you can learn in your personal life and then, bring it back into your professional life.
Super helpful. So this is really, I think, a main focus of the committee is almost like, get the leadership involved, but then overcome that fear factor just by education, by getting people to almost like as an analogy, like take that first ride in the elevator and see that it's safe, right? And or see like, how much better it is than taking the stairs up.
Yeah. I mean, look, technology is part of this. It's not just about even raising awareness or education, but getting the solutions in the hands of the individuals and showing them that art of the possible. And if I give you one more example, I was meeting with, one of our business units in one of our subsidiary companies, and they're doing research, and I showed them just kind of a deep think capability of one of the generative AI platforms, and it kind of opened up their eyes on how to do research. They were doing research in very traditional ways of using search engines or downloading white papers and so on and so forth, and they had no idea of these deep think type capabilities of the that are on the AI platform. So that person now has changed the way they're doing research, right? So that's just one example where awareness coupled with hands-on access to the tool set really made the difference.
No, perfect. Listen, Mike, thank you so much. Thanks for sharing the experience here. Thanks for being a pioneer at Canon with this committee for Gen AI. So I really hope that the audience took something away from today that kind of been motivated to them to get onto their own journey, to form their own committee. And I think you gave them a good compass how to go about this. So I wanted to say thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Markus. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. Please make sure to rate today's episode, leave us a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the show so you will never miss an episode. I'll see you next time.